first things first, there are a lot of ways, obviously, to sort of chord your way up and down the neck. What I want to do is something that I do with all of my own students right out of the gate, which is basically get a sense of positional awareness with regards to your chord vocabulary. What I mean by that is I want to be able to translate, let's say we have a G major 7 chord that we're trying to play. I want to be able to translate that one sound, that one idea up and down the guitar's fretboard fluently. There's a bunch of different ways to come at it, but just as a sort of a quick review, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one sound, in this case a G major 7 chord, and just to warm up, what I would typically do is kind of take that sound and move it through different shapes. And so we have root position, G major 7 shapes, and I'm back to where I started, not the fire. So basically with those chords, you can play those same 5 shapes, obviously in any given key. You can convert them into minor 7s and do the same exercise. So those are my bread and butter R&B chords for minor vocabulary. You can also do dominant 7 chords, which I would put in the same chord shapes. So E shape, D shape, as I think about it, C shape, A shape, G shape, so on and so forth, okay? So maybe you want to get those together too. And then from there, we can start putting some color into those chord voicings. So what I'm talking about are 9s, 11s, and 13s. And we can put any of those sounds into any of these basic chord voicings. We're going to be putting 9s and 13s on our major chords for the most part. For those of you who aren't maybe familiar with the idea here, 9s are just 2s, really, in terms of the scale. So again, to relate it to G, a 9 is an A in relation to G, which is just the 2 of the scale, okay? But we call it a 9, and so to put a 9 on that chord, you can do something like that. Any of those would qualify as major 9 chords. You can also put major 13s on those. You can do a major 13 9. There's a lot of different ways to start putting those in there. On their minor chords, we're going to be looking at 11s and 13s. For the most part, 11s, and we'll get some 9s in there as well. But basically, as an easy exercise for yourself, what I would do is take those 5 K shapes, and I start to find in each given shape where let's say the 9 is in relation to that chord shape. So if we're in E shape, so I'm just based off this really common major 7 shape. For those of you that want a real basis in cage, it's just E shape, like your major bar chord. Make it major 7, and your 9s are there with regards to the shape. So all I'm doing to build more harmonically complex chords is I'm taking familiar shapes that I play all the time, and then finding where the additional extensions might be. In relation to my chord tones, I want extensions, so all the notes that are outside that chord but still inside the key. So what you could do, for example, in this position is, given that there's an A right there, or a 9, what I'll do is I will sacrifice, in some cases, one note to get another. So in this case, I have an A on my G string. I'm going to remove the note that I already have on the B string, which in this case is the 3rd, to get that A. Basically, this is a perfectly colorful, really slick chord that we might use in an R&B context, okay? If you want to get the 3rd back in there, you would actually have to like make a bar across here. But what you'll find is that oftentimes when you start to go through this exercise, you start coming up with chord voicings you've never played before, just as a byproduct of the thought process or the experiment of having to find one way to accommodate a new note, as we did there, and then feeling that maybe something's lacking. Now you're asking yourself, how do I get a 3rd back in there without sacrificing the note we added? Maybe in the process of doing that, you end up barring all the way across to the high E string, and now you're going to put a 7 in on top. The point being, when we think about chord voicings and start looking at extensions, oftentimes people feel a little bit overburdened. It's been my experience teaching this stuff anyways, and it's my experience when I was a teacher. And the fact of the matter is, if you want to look at each one of those different chords and each one of those different extensions in each of the different possible permutations up and down the neck on all of the string sets, there's a lot of different ways to play these chords, and it's totally, it feels like an insurmountable challenge to learn that stuff. And I don't want any of my students or any of you guys to think about it in that manner. It can be simplified to basically just thinking in 5 common shapes, and these In these cases, I'm just thinking K shapes, but whatever your chosen shapes are that you play all the time, just stick within those, orient yourself around the root, ask yourself, maybe even write down what are the color tones in relation to the chord in the key that I'm playing them. So G in this case, I'm thinking of A's for my 9s, right? C's for my 11s, so on and so forth, E's for my 13s. And just ask yourself, how do I play any one of those given notes in a shape that you play all the time? If we move it up to A shape, this one's probably super familiar to you guys. So again, I'm just playing a G major 7 in this case. If I ask myself where the 9 is, I'm going to be looking for an A. It's probably the most common voicing of that chord there. But all I'm doing again is I'm just asking myself, where is the A in this given part of the fretboard for a G major 7 chord, and I'm adding that note in. And you can do it in a variety of different ways. So I just took my pinky off, I've got one. There's no third in that anymore though, because the note I gave up to get it was the third. If you want to keep that third, maybe you reorient yourself in this way. So this is a bit of like trial and error, going through this and trying to find different ways to find the voicings that you like. Obviously, there are favorites. We have a nice compository of them. I mean, I certainly do. In terms of like each shape, I have got like my 3 or so favorites. But that's essentially the exercise in terms of developing your vocabulary for these kinds of chords. So just try to like use your bread and butter voicings, the ones that you're comfortable playing, and then you're going to try to insert those into songs you already know. Maybe like take a simple chord progression that you might play in everyday life. Let's just say we're doing like a 1, 6, 4 kind of thing. And now let's do it in the key D just to switch it up. Okay. So prior, I might have just played minor 7s. Okay. And major 7s. Okay. So I'm only using A shape, E shape, and C shape here. And there's nothing wrong with those. I mean, they would work in an R&B context for sure. But what we want to do again is get a little bit of color in there. So if we wanted to start adding some color, I'm just going to grab some common shapes. So there's my D major 9 now, instead of 7, D major 9. Okay. Now I'm going to go to that B minor. Maybe I want to put an 11 on this. Okay. So same idea. Oftentimes students will play it this way, right? For our B minor 7. In this shape, why don't we drop that 5? 5 is kind of a boring note anyways. Drop that 5 down to a 4, which is really an 11. Okay, so now we have already, I mean, I don't want to show my bias too strongly here, but already that's sounding more interesting to my ears. We have a common tone on top, meaning that there's an E on top of my D, and there's an E on top of my B. Okay, and now just for the hell of it, why don't we put some color in this chord as well? Okay, so we could just go up to that same major 9 chord shape that we played for the D. We could also throw in like a little just like R&B lick like that, where basically I'm playing the same shape, but I'm hammering into it. So it's really not all that different. It's kind of more like C shape, I suppose, with the 9 on top. But I'm playing a hammer into the lowest note, and then you'll hammer again from your bar onto the next chord tone, and then hammer again onto your color tone or your extension. So now we have. So basically, what I'm kind of doing there in terms of like creating some movement or some like melodic shape to that, which is pretty like idiomatic for the style, is you get your given chord progression. First step, maybe you want to color it up a bit. Find some extensions in those shapes that you like. Next thing you do to dress it up a bit is you'll see I'm doing a lot of like little hammer on the licks. That one or anything like that provides a little bit of movement. And then if you really want to provide some shape, which is something I would typically do, maybe if there's no vocals happening, I don't want to fill things out, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start to move between my shapes in any given sort of a block of harmony. What I mean by that, to simplify, is basically if I'm on a D major 7 harmony, I don't have to feel relegated to only playing the voicing that I've chosen for myself up front. So this is kind of, I mean, partly what appealed to me about R&B initially after like going to jazz school is that there's a lot of correlations there in terms of like comping, where you're given a given harmony, in this case, let's say D major. But D major doesn't mean you just play it always in the same fashion. It's kind of dictated by the course of the song that you're playing over and what everyone else is doing. And so it's free flowing. If I wanted to sort of start moving from that D major 7 into other D major 7s within the context of the song, I'm well within my right to do so. And it's kind of the style to do it in that manner. So again, sort of demonstrate that, what I'll start to do is play the basic chords, and then I'll start to kind of like freely flow between the different cage shapes. And again, I'm just using the same shapes that we did at the top of the lesson here, right? Those same like basic shapes. All I'm doing is kind of creating little melodies to kind of time my way into the next shape. So again, as an example, basically it's the same idea. Really all I'm doing is just taking my initial shape, and then I'm playing whatever shape follows it. And then oftentimes just rocking back and forth between those. You don't have to start on the lower shape and always do the slide up into the higher version. Maybe you start on the higher shape. It's all about what notes you're kind of like emphasizing on the top. That's like your perceived melody on top of your chords, so to speak. So again, the amount of this sort of liberty taking I take in my rhythm playing is dictated by whatever else is happening in the song. And so if the singer is singing, I'd advise all of you to probably dial it back pretty significantly, unless you want to get fired from your gig. But if you're just kind of like vibing on something, and like, I mean, there's so many examples of this. If you want to look at, I'm just thinking of it because we're in the same key. If you want to look at George Benson's Breezing, technically it's like somewhere in that spectrum, right, like between jazz and R&B, and that's kind of what I love about George's music, is it kind of rides that line really nicely. But, so right off the top, there's nothing happening really. So that's an example of where I. So I might move around a little bit more. And again, all I'm doing is I'm kind of just moving between cage shapes in my head, but I'm using a lot more of the top 4 string courses, which we're coming to, I promise. Anyways, I see some questions here.